conference, in fact. When was that, 2013?
Yeah,
14,
yeah,
maybe?
2015. Yeah.
And this unassuming chap that I just got started chatting to turned out that he was a GP from Stroud, and even more so, it turned out that he had had quite a transformation within himself because he himself lives with type 1 diabetes and has had an incredible transformation that he's going to be talking about today. So,
Yeah,
Dr. Ian Lake.
Hello. Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. I'm a GP in Stroud, and there's quite a few of us from Gloucestershire here, aren't there, guys? Put your hands up. Really good contingent from Gloucestershire. I didn't know you were from Gloucestershire. Great. Yeah, today I'm going to talk about not too much of a personal transformation, but how I feel that the current NICE guidelines are failing the majority of people with type 1, what the alternative is, and I think you may have guessed that, and some ideas really whilst we're waiting for official sources to change their minds, some ideas on how people might want to think about starting a keto lifestyle, but obviously I can only give information and not advice. I was diagnosed 22 years ago, and for the first 20 years of my diabetic life I preached and practiced the same thing, which was the standard diet that was, you all know, in the NHS. Over those 20 years I didn't improve my HbA1c outside of the diabetic range, so I was in the diabetic range for all of those 20 years. After a piece of luck, a lucky dip Google, I discovered Richard Bernstein's book, which a lot of people know of here if they have type 1 diabetes, and that pretty well was a light bulb moment and transformed my life. I was pretty ashamed that I hadn't actually seen the light before, as a lot of people probably understand that. And since I've been on the ketogenic lifestyle, I've not had a HbA1c outside of the diabetic range. They're all in the non-diabetic range and some in the normal range. So I want to talk about that, how to achieve that today. I'm one of the lucky ones. I can choose whether or not I adopt the ketogenic lifestyle, or I can choose whether or not I adopt the NHS guideline lifestyle. It's entirely up to me. Now, when we all get up in the mornings, all healthcare practitioners of any sort want to do well for Carter Beale. Everyone's gunning for Carter Beale. I know Carter, and he was diagnosed a year ago with diabetes, roughly, and he wasn't doing particularly well with his management, and he only had one option for treatment. There was no other option for Carter. It was NHS management or nothing. Luckily, he discovered by complete accident the ketogenic lifestyle, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now, I think that situation is not really good enough. I mean, it shouldn't be that families with a very difficult diagnosis at a young age then have to struggle to get good control, and then once they've found an alternative, by complete luck, have to have the sheer courage to go against orthodox medical practice and go it alone. And I think we would all agree that everyone who is diagnosed with diabetes should get options at diagnosis so they can make their own mind up. If they choose not to take that advice, that's entirely up to them, but I think it's incumbent on us all in the NHS to offer this with competent, highly qualified staff at diagnosis. It's just not good enough at the moment, I don't think. Before I get really started, when I'd started to look at all of the evidence, I started to realise that nearly all of the studies that have been done in the NICE guidelines are based on 55 to 60% carbohydrate diets. So all of the studies on statins, all of the studies on cholesterol, all of the studies on type 1 and type 2 diabetes are done in the background of a high carbohydrate diet. So I thought, well, none of those really apply to me, so I don't really know what my risk is. We do know that there are studies around that actually show that the low carbohydrate diet is better, but they're still emerging. And that isn't a ketogenic filter, but if you want one, you're welcome. This is the old Belgian bard, Einstein himself. he didn't have much time to do maths because he was spending most of his time doing quotes, as we all know. And he said, didn't he, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And I think that's very, very true. I mean, the current model, I can understand with diabetes, if you think about 30 years ago when modern insulins were developed, it must have been very difficult for patients to have a very restricted diet and no glucometers and struggling away probably with lots of high sugars. It must have been very difficult for them indeed. And then came along rapid insulins whereby patients could eat a certain food and bring their blood glucose down very, very quickly. So we can sort of see where the current intensive insulin modification ideas come from, can't we? But just to simply keep applying that principle in the modern era when we really know better is not really going to make any difference, is it? We've got really high quality pumps, we've got people working really hard with algorithms, and we've unfortunately got the completely wrong diet. So if we can crack if we can crack the diet, it'll make life much, much easier for all of those people manufacturing equipment at the moment. And I want to just look at this study, which only came out in March. This is the reposed study, and this was essentially a study looking to see whether insulin pumping in people with type 1 was better than intensive insulin injections. And it was a top draw study. Sort of the Premier League of researchers were involved in this, and it was a study with added DAPHNE. So they looked at educational programs for diabetes, of which DAPHNE is the only one that's recommended by name, and they combined that with either an insulin pump or with intensive lifestyle. So these were really pampered patients. And DAPHNE is quite a good course, really. It teaches a lot about insulins, it teaches a lot about managing hypos, ketoacidosis and infections, etc. But one thing I fundamentally disagree with, really, is the dietary recommendations. Here we go. Can I really eat what I want? You can read it. Yes, except for having sugary drinks, you can adjust your insulin to cover anything you choose to have. DAPHNE allows people to eat what they want when they want, and this includes eating if you do not feel like it. So a slight nod to fasting, but essentially that is the same philosophy as when the rapid-acting insulins first came out. Doing more of the same and expecting different results is not going to get us anywhere. Now, these are the companies that the researchers wrote down as their competing interests. I'm passing no comment on anything other than to say that these high priests of research, some of the best researchers in the world, had interest from most of the companies working in pharmaceuticals. These were the glitterati of the diabetes world. If there's a Hello magazine for diabetes, these guys will be in it along with Dave Unwin by the pool. And they came to the conclusion that the results would appear to support the current clinical pathway as proposed by NICE, in which, and this is a strange phrase, people desiring improved diabetes control, just in case there aren't any, undergo structured training, blah, 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 with multiple daily injections. So they came out in favour of daily injections and multiple daily injections and structured training. And what results do they get? Well, diabetes guidelines suggest we aim for a target HbA1c of now only 6.5% or 48 millimoles per mole, which has come down quite a lot from 7.5% only 5 years earlier. A lot of people think that's a very tough target to meet, but that's the target we're sort of encouraged to meet in type 1s. And the results show that if you look at the one on the right, the red writing, that the number of people in that study, the pampered patients with added DAPHNE, only 3.3% of that population achieved the NICE guideline figure. So that means 97% of the people with diabetes type 1 in this country are not meeting the target despite an amazingly intensive program of management. And that red line, red arrow, those red arrows are the incidence of heart disease with rising HbA1c. You can see that HbA1c goes up when you have HbA1c goes up and the cardiovascular disease incidence goes up. Don't forget your ketogenic filter here, but I think the principle's probably still the same. And interestingly, the line to the right of that is actually, I think this is a type 2 graph, but the line to the right of that is the effect of insulin, the effect of medication, which is not really very good, is it really? Now, but there is another way. Don't let's all despair. This is a graph in 2 parts, obviously. The red line represents the US population distribution of HbA1c. I think it's nearly applicable to the UK. But as you can see, if you look at the lower line and go at about 6.5%, anything to the left of that represents the number of people that are actually achieving the target, and anything to the right shows the people not achieving the target. And I'm sure you'd agree that probably that's better than our figures, slightly more than 3% probably achieving the target, but the vast majority, 97%, are not achieving target. And then if you look at the blue graph, that is the figures for about the 2,000 children from the US program Type 1 GRIT, where they're encouraged to use the ketogenic lifestyle. And as you can see, if you take the 6.5% line again, the vast majority of people fall under that line, and most of them look in the normal range. So they have normal glycemic control, which is fantastic. So whereas the NICE guidelines are failing 97% of our population, the ketogenic lifestyle seems to benefit 97% of the diabetes population. And I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind. And you get a reduction in HbA1c, and you get a reduction in cardiovascular disease as a result. Just a simple diet. And if you had diabetes, which one would you go for? I know which one I'd go for. And that is entirely due to a ketogenic lifestyle. There's no other changes that need to be made to achieve that, apart from probably lowering your insulin a little bit. But you say it's not in the guidelines. Well, I sent a study off to the guidelines asking, quite innocently, I keep recommending this to my patients, but I want to make sure I'm on safe ground doing this. And they wrote back and said that the NICE guidelines specifically excluded low-carb diets from their evidence search. Which is pretty amazing, really, isn't it, in this day and age? They state, they asked, to be fair, the question they asked was, is carbohydrate restriction stroke counting useful technique in management of type 1? And then when they set out the criteria for answering that question, for some silly reason they excluded low carbohydrate diets. So the guideline did not address the question of carbohydrate content, only whether teaching adults to count carbs was beneficial. I mean, that is a big error. That's a massive error, isn't it? So the person who's dealing with this is being very helpful, but we haven't got a reply yet as to what they think they might want to do about it. But the lack of guideline evidence does not mean lack of evidence. This is a study which some people probably know by a guy called Nielsen. I think it's Denmark, isn't it? Finland, Scandinavia. And he used a 4-year program of 75 grams of carbohydrate only in type 1, people with type 1. He got a reduction of about 1.6% HbA1c. There was about a 90% reduction in the number of hypos that these people were having, and about 60% of people retained their diet for 4 years. And it showed that the lower the carbs, the better your HbA1c was going to be. So that was a study I sent to NICE and say, well, why didn't you include it? Because NICE didn't just want randomized controlled trials. They were quite happy to take observational trials at that time. That was it's in Appendix C of the NICE guidelines. I probably think if you can be bothered, it might be worth everyone writing to NICE and just flooding them with this. Because once I'm sure they have sort of algorithms that once they trigger a certain number of people, they probably might start to take it a little bit more seriously. And that's the sort of figures they get. But the key thing which I want to talk about now, whoops, that came on off. Sorry, the insulin reduction, the daytime insulin reduction in that trial was from 23 units a day to 13 units a day. So people were injecting a huge amount of insulin less than they would otherwise be. Now, diabetes type 1 is thought of as a condition of hormone deficiency, isn't it? You don't have any insulin in your body, so you have to inject it. And normally, a hormone deficiency, you just use hormone replacement therapy, don't you? If you inject the right amount of insulin. Oh, can we have a bit louder? Or just shout? Yeah. If we have the right amount of insulin, then we'll have good control, won't we? Now, I've been a doctor now for over 30 years, and I've seen a lot of nasty things in my time, but what I'm about to show you is one of the most shocking things. It's chilling thing, but so if you have a delicate sensibility, as they say on the television, look away now. And none of you have looked away, you ghoulish people. Now, it's a complicated graph. I don't want to go any more than graphs A and B, and probably J at the bottom. But A, this is a study of people with and without diabetes sleeping. So, and the people with diabetes had had diabetes for about 12 years, and they had an average HbA1c of about 7.5%. So not too bad. And if you were just replacing that insulin, the white dots are people with no diabetes, and the black dots are people with diabetes. So just look at the graph A for a start. The glucose levels, that represents glucose throughout the night, are slightly higher than people with no diabetes, which runs at about, 5? And the glucose levels of people with diabetes running 6 to 8, which, it's not too bad, is it? But if you look at graph B, and this is the really chilling graph, the levels of insulin are sky high all through the night. That is not hormone replacement therapy, that is insulin resistance. You can see, I'm sure this is long-acting insulin, it's just trickling down throughout the night, but you've still got a high level of glucose, and it seems that that graph is delinked from the one to its left, doesn't it? It's not that much relation between the glucose and the insulin. That is insulin resistance. And I think insulin resistance is the curse of type 1s. Really, we all die of the same disease as type 2s, by and large, apart from hypos, of course. But the last thing on this slide is graph J at the bottom, and that little black line going up there, that's leptin. Now, clearly, all the other hormones involved there are still asleep, but leptin's woken up to this, and it's actually going up in value throughout the night compared with non-diabetics. And I think that's because there's so much metabolic mayhem going on, so much insulin resistance. The leptin is trying to stop the person from eating when they wake up in the morning. Leptin, as you know, suppresses the appetite. So I think that leptin has woken up and said, please don't eat, please don't eat, please don't eat. And the first thing that person's likely to do when they wake up is have a bowl of porridge, isn't it? So it's just going to be compounding the problem. And I think that is a serious problem, and it has to be addressed at some stage, because I think when you get control of type 1 diabetes with a ketogenic diet, there's a lot of insulin resistance to get out of the system. And if you've had diabetes for any length of time, as you know, the age-related glycated end products, the AGEs, the glucose sticking to cells, just stick everything down. And I think they scar tissue and cause all sorts of problems. So it's probably very difficult if you've had diabetes for a long time to completely reverse your insulin resistance, but it is possible to reverse insulin resistance. And it's iatrogenic type 2, doctor-induced type 2, caused by the treatment for type 1. Well-intentioned, but it's still happening. And that's why the graph I showed you earlier on of the reduction in the amount of insulin being injected with a low-carb diet, I think that's very useful. We're cutting down the amount of insulin, which is almost certainly a good idea. It's type me, I've said, because everyone will have, it depends how long you've had diabetes, etc., what your body makeup is, how much insulin resistance you've got, how much type 1 you've got, etc. And don't read that, but after just 40 hours of over-infusing insulin in non-diabetic subjects, you began to see evidence of poor utilization of glucose. Insulin resistance happening at just 40 hours of hyperinsulinemia. So if you're diagnosed on a Monday morning and your hospital nurse puts you on insulin, by Tuesday night, you're going to have some type 2 as well as type 1. Not quite. I mean, that's an over-exaggeration, but you get the picture. This is the book that everyone with type 1 diabetes should have at least heard of and read. Whether they choose to take it up or not is up to them. It's quite a dense book, but it's an invaluable book. It's a manual of how-to in type 1 diabetes. It will get you there. It will get you onto the ketogenic lifestyle. This book should be handed out to every newly diagnosed type 1 family. Now, things that people might find useful if they're attempting the ketogenic lifestyle. Well, eating real food, we've done that all day and yesterday, and it's fantastic, and I agree with everything. Nature provides the right nutrients for us if only we stop processing them. And if you're really nerdy, you can get onto nutrition facts and all those graphs and things, or you can just enjoy your food. This, I think, is the most significant of the things that you have to do when you go keto. You have to perfect your insulin, and you have to perfect your basal insulin. This is the easiest way to do it. I think if you've got a pump, it's probably easier still if you can cope with the cumbersomeness of the pump. But this is talking about perfecting basal insulin, which the majority of people are on. Now, if you're an existing type 1 and you're already on basal insulin, that's the Lantus or whatever, mostly I think people who change find their basal levels about right from the start. So whatever they're injecting basally is about right. To test your levels of to test your effectiveness of your basal insulin, just fast after you wake up. That will extend your fast and the basal insulin will still be carrying on working. And obviously if the glucose levels go up or down, it will inform you as to whether or not you're injecting slightly too much or slightly too little, bearing in mind the dawn phenomenon in type 1 where the glucose tends to rise first thing in the morning. But essentially, if you can then extend your fasting periods, you should get a reasonably flat glucose trace on basal insulin, and that is essentially your hormone replacement therapy. And then you can cut your carbs to 30 grams a day if you want to, and carb count. You can apply Daphne if you want to. You can count your carbs. If you're eating just 30 grams of carbs, what is that, 3 units of insulin throughout the day? You're happy to count carbs. If you're familiar with carb counting, that's absolutely fine. Split the carbs up throughout the day. Most people probably on the ketogenic lifestyle only choose 2 meals a day, and that's perfectly safe with type 1 diabetes. Cutting carbs to 30 grams a day is supposed to get you into nutritional ketosis, which is a completely safe way of operating. It's nothing to do with ketoacidosis, as we all know in this room. But in some cases, you probably won't get into, I don't think, nutritional ketosis all the time. You have a lot of glucose being made by the liver, and sometimes it's quite difficult to keep your glucose levels down. So you may go in and out of ketosis. Sorry about this slide, but it's a screenshot. But if you're getting stuck, most people will go on to something like MyFitnessPal, which will be a nutrition counter, really calorie counter and carb counter, etc. They're not brilliantly accurate, but they get you there pretty well. My advice, if anyone wanted to do this, would be just to look at several different types of the same food, because it will give you slightly different readings, and you can input this, you can change it yourself if you want to. Fasting is allowed. Now, this is probably for adults, so I'm not expert enough with children to know what to do with that, but certainly for adults, fasting is allowed. This is my unashamed plug for my blog, which at the moment is temporarily suspended, but it'll come back. I was very keen when I got started on the ketogenic lifestyle to try to encourage, or try to prove really, to our diabetes team that you do not need carbohydrates if you're injecting insulin. There's sort of this insistence that if you inject insulin, you've got to have carbs. Your body's making carbs all the time. You don't need to eat anything. Your body will make enough for you. So I hatched this plan to run 12 half marathons in 12 months using the ketogenic diet, just to see what happened, really. And I managed to prove after just 3 runs that you didn't need carbs with insulin. So that was dead easy. And then I felt, well, what about fasting? How are we going to get on with fasting? Because I thought, well, if you're just burning fat all the time in your body, why don't, and I was getting into things like bulletproof coffees just before, 500 calories. Well, a half marathon's about 1,200 calories roughly, and that's about 5 ounces, whatever that is, in grams of fat. And I thought, well, I've got more than enough of that. So I thought, well, if I'm just burning fat, why don't I just burn a bit more fat at a bit more of a fast rate by just fasting? And it was fantastic. It's really, really good. So I did 6 half marathons on a 13-hour fast, and then a 13-mile run, which is perfectly fine. Glucose control was pretty good most of the way. Occasionally you get the odd high. Very occasionally at about 9, 11 miles, about an hour and a half out, you probably need 2 or 3 glucose tablets only. Continuous metering helps enormously with this. But the thing about the ketogenic lifestyle with type 1 diabetes is that you don't really feel you have diabetes, and that is the biggest freedom you can have if you've ever been tied to insulin carbohydrate counting regimes. In fact, I called this blog Extreme Diabetes, and I went under a pseudonym because I didn't really want to put this out as a medical doctor. I thought it might sound a bit irresponsible. But as I got involved in this, I felt this is not extreme diabetes at all. The guys that are carb counting are there doing the extreme diabetes. I'm having a very easy ride here. I didn't have to adjust my insulin before I ran. I didn't have to monitor throughout the run. And when I'd finished, I just went home. I didn't have to monitor right through into the night, just in case I had a hypo. It was as normal as it can be. So nothing wrong with fasting in type 1, because I think we have a lot of type 2, and the same principle applies. Move well. I think as well as eating, we need to move. Physical activity for type 1s is an integral part of the ketogenic lifestyle. We should be moving around every day. We don't need to get into lycra. You can do dancing, you can just garden, you can do anything, but be active, move around. I think posture is very important for well-being, and I think, I think that affects your stress levels and everything. So, you know, get used to having good posture and whatever. There must be a lot of practitioners out here who do lots of different physical activities, and do what you can. But I think it is an integral part of the lifestyle. And I think just doing, yeah, fine, perfect. I think just doing those two things will get most people a long, long way. This is interesting, and I've just thrown this up for you. I'm not passing any comment either way, but I wrote to these people, Paleomedicina in Hungary, who I know do the Paleolithic ketogenic diet. And I said, I've got this low carb program, what do you think? And they wrote back and said, well, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Because we always say, don't we, if you have a disease of carbohydrate intolerance, why on earth would you want to eat carbohydrates? And they came back and said, that's true, but if you've got a condition of your body which is causing, if you've got inflammation in your body which is caused by a diet, why are you eating a diet that causes inflammation? That set me back a little bit, and I thought, that's an interesting concept. They're basing this really on the fact that our genetic ancestry is one of meat eating, mostly four-legged animals with minimal everything else. And they feel that meat isn't inflammatory to the bowel because it's genetically inherited, if you say inherited genetically. So they would cut out pretty well everything apart from fat and meat. You'd have fat in a 2 grams to 1 gram of protein ratio. It's not, and they feel that if the gut isn't inflamed by the foods, the tight junctions between the cells and the epithelium of the intestine won't leak those food proteins into the bloodstream, and therefore you won't get autoimmune disease. They've got something on their website to show they've got 1 or 2 people into long-term remission, 4 or 5 years. But I just threw that in because I think it's an interesting concept, whether or not it leads to anything in the longer term. Sleep well. Circadian rhythms, the daily rhythms we have, can affect insulin resistance. If you sleep-deprived people, you get lots of insulin resistance. There's something called a suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that regulates all of the cycles in our body, digestive system, alertness, and we're quite alert, not very alert at this time of day, are we, etc., etc. If you phase shift those rhythms, you can become quite ill with insulin resistance. So sleep well. And if you're one of those people, like a lot of people here, tweet late at night, I see the timestamps on tweets, you may want to download this thing called Flux. It's free, and it just reduces your screen brightness. It takes the blue-green light out of your screen, so you can text at 1 in the morning and still have a good night's sleep. Challenge misinformation. This is from Diabetes UK. This was on the website last week. I've just been diagnosed with type 1. What can I eat? In one word, anything. It may come as a surprise, and yes, it did, but all kinds of food are fine for people with type 1 to eat. In the past, people were sent away with their diagnosis with a very restrictive diet plan. This was because the availability of insulin was limited. As insulin treatments have been developed to be much more flexible, the days of do's and don'ts are long gone. The way to go now, these days, is to try and fit the diabetes and insulin around your lifestyle with the same healthy, balanced diet recommended for everyone. Lots of fruit and veg, and some fruit from all of the food groups. Totally irresponsible. I think that's verging on the negligent. And I think you ought to challenge this information. I write to them regularly. They've stopped writing back now because they know who I am. But this needs challenging. This is irresponsible. These guys are relied on by families like the Beales that we showed right at the start. They're relied on for accurate information. Our Prime Minister relies on that, and look what happened to her. And accept the unknown. We don't know everything. We know what we know. We're here because of our historical scientific discoveries and our beliefs. But we do know that there's a lot that we can do to almost get normal glycemic control. So we just have to accept that we are where we are, and there's a lot more to learn, so we shouldn't just be trying to shoehorn everything into just our theory. We tend to shoehorn everything into the insulin glucose model, but we all know there's a lot more to it than that. And just be well good. Eat well, move well, sleep well, reduce inflammation, and reduce your stress if you can. That's quite difficult, but if you're actually getting better with your diabetes, your stress will definitely go down. And thrive. It doesn't have to be like it is. There are alternatives. We need to spread the word. Hopefully, the guidelines will change. Hopefully, all of the people currently not agreeing with our point of view will see the light. But if not, this will have to be a revolution from the ground up. And as Andreas was saying, once you get to a certain point, that revolution will happen, and hopefully we're close to being there. And I just want to show you a lovely video that someone sent me on Tuesday. It's about a very brave family, and it's heartwarming, and if you've got hankies, get them out now. And that is why we all do what we do, and we must keep on doing it. As long as we bear people like that in mind, we'll get there. And I'm very proud to say that we've got the co-star and director of that film here today. She's come all the way over from Doncaster to take the accolades, which she truly deserves. So a very traditional PHC welcome to Rachel Beale.